Welcome to 70 Years and Beyond. My name is Wambui Bahati, a nostalgia enthusiast born in Greensboro, North Carolina in 1950. I love sharing the stories from the 50s, the 60s, and 70s. It is my desire to keep those stories and our personal history and our family legacy alive. So come with me as we go back in time today. We're going to go back to the 1950s. Now, in the 1950s, in North Carolina, Jim Crow laws were still on the books. My mother worked as a domestic, meaning she would travel across town by bus to the white neighborhood and she would clean houses and sometimes take care of people's children on that side, on the white side of town. My father worked for the United States Post Office as a mail handler. And because of Jim Crow laws, there weren't that many places that we could go. But even if we could, I don't know as a family we could have afforded to have gone to that many places. I do know, besides Vacation Bible School in the summer, our favorite vacation destination was Goldsboro, North Carolina. Goldsboro is where my mother was from. So all of her family and relatives lived in Goldsboro, North Carolina. My father was from South Carolina. We rarely traveled that far to see his family, but we would go to Goldsboro for when we thought we were going on vacation. Our vacation was Goldsboro, North Carolina. And so sometimes we'd go during the winter, fall, or around Christmas time mainly. We would travel to Goldsboro, and always in the summer, we would spend some weeks down in Goldsboro, North Carolina. And it was always fun and interesting because we didn't really have any relatives, no cousins or anything in Greensboro, but all of our relatives and cousins were down in Goldsboro, North Carolina. And so we would look forward to going to visit to meet cousins. And my mother was always about, we want you to meet these relatives. We want you to meet this family. We want you to meet I got some cousins I want you to meet. And so that was always pretty exciting. So we didn't have a car. So my grandfather would drive from Goldsboro to Greensboro to pick us up, to take us to our vacation destination. And he never made the trip alone. So he usually brought my Aunt Thelma with him. Sometimes it would be him, my Aunt Thelma, and my Grandma Beatty. But most of the time it was him and my Aunt Thelma because by the time they got to Greensboro, well, you got 4 kids plus my mother. My father would go sometimes, but most of the time he would stay back to work. So my mother would travel with the 4 kids. Like I say, when we got a little older, sometimes she'd send us by herself. But so you got all these people getting in the car. So you got 2 people coming up to get us, and then you got 5 people getting in that car going back for this ride. There were no seatbelts or seatbelt laws. There were no seatbelts at that time. So people just piled in the car wherever you could fit, on the floor, the floorboard, even in the front seat. People, it was not uncommon to see somebody holding a child in the front seat of a car. And we just traveled. However you could travel, we would travel. And so we would make that trip back to Goldsboro, North Carolina. Oh my God, that trip lasted 2 days. No, it didn't. I'm exaggerating. It seemed like it lasted 2 days. The trip was only, now that I look at it, the trip was only like 3 hours at the most. You can go from Greensboro to Goldsboro now in like 2.5 to 3 hours. So we would make that trip, but for us kids, it seemed like it took forever. But I tell you, I enjoyed that ride. I enjoyed going from Greensboro to Goldsboro. And even as a child, I appreciated that scenery. I appreciated seeing how peaceful and calm things were as we just rode down the highway on our way to Goldsboro. I appreciated the corn that we used to see, the tobacco, and if it was fall or winter, I remember seeing fields and fields of cotton, and we'd pass cows, herds of cows and hogs, just a lot of farmland on our way to from Greensboro to Goldsboro. And it was such a beautiful scene that when I think about it now, I think that's how beautiful that was. But then, even as a child, like I said, I appreciated how beautiful that ride was. When we would get to Goldsboro, my grandma, my grandpa, and my auntie lived together in one house in the city limits of Goldsboro, North Carolina. Now, most of our cousins lived outside the city limits in what we called the country. So we would travel to the country to visit various relatives out there. And of course, like I said, my mother was always anxious to say, "Oh, I want you to meet this cousin." And my mother was very keen about wanting to make sure we understood where we came from, who was related to who. And my mother was, and we would pass a house, for instance, and my mother would say, "Now that's the house your grandma was born in. She had 12 brothers and sisters, and that's where they lived when they were growing up." Or we'd see a little shack somewhere, and she'd say, "Now that's where your uncle this was born, and that's where," and or she'd say, "When I was a kid, that's where we used to go hang out and play over here at Aunt Donna's house." And she was, when I think about it, she was very intent on keeping the legacy alive too. And sometimes we would get tired. We weren't interested in going to visit any more cousins and relatives. We just wanted to go somewhere and play with our jack rocks or play run, red light and things like that. But we would continue. My mother would say, "Come on, I want you to meet these people over here. Now, this is your grandma's sister, blah, blah, blah." And she was just really explaining who everybody was. And she wanted her children to know who all their relatives were. So I do remember that they lived, like I said, in the country, that they had a whole different lifestyle, some of them, than what I had seen growing up in Greensboro and what we had in Greensboro. I saw relatives that had hand crank wells where they had a well and they drew water up in a bucket from a well. There were relatives, a few, not all, but a few who still had outhouses. So if you had to go to the bathroom, you had to go outside the house and go outside to that's why it's called an outhouse. And at those times, of course, I had always prayed that I didn't have to go to the bathroom. Please allow me, please, God, let me hold it, because I didn't want to have to use the outhouse. It was just a very different world just from growing up in Greensboro, what was normal to us in Greensboro and seeing the relatives there. One thing too is I remember even at my grandma's house, there were kerosene lamps. Now her house had electricity, had a bathroom inside. At least by the time we came along, I came along, they did. Because I remember also that my grandma had a wood stove in the kitchen. And in the winter, we would gather around that wood stove and hang out in the kitchen to be warm. But I also remember that my grandmother could cook a whole meal on that wood stove. Now, eventually, I do remember that inside the kitchen, there was an electric stove. But the wood stove never went away, but there was an electric stove that came. And so they would actually do cooking on both of them. And so it was just a very, very different world than we live in today, just experiencing these things. Oh, and I thought my grandmother's house was amazing in that it was what they call a railroad. I think it's called a railroad house, where there are rooms on this side and there are rooms on this side. And you can literally open the front door and see all the way back into the backyard. You had a straight shot into the backyard because the rooms were on either side. And there was this long hallway that just went from the front of the house to the back of the house. So those are some of the memories that I have about growing up in the 1950s in North Carolina, visiting my relatives. So I'm going to leave that right there for now. I just wanted to take you on a little walk back down memory lane with me. So thank you. Thank you for spending your time with me, and I'll see you in the next video.